Nia Holloway had exactly $1 left in her pocket when she pushed through the rain and into the store. She bought the last scratch ticket on the rack, telling herself it was just 1 minute of hope before heading back to an apartment where the rent had been overdue for weeks. But the moment her coin touched the silver surface, the man in the expensive coat standing behind her said, "That ticket is mine." Before Nia could answer, the manager had locked the door, called security, and accused her of stealing from a billionaire. Then 3 jackpot symbols appeared. If you want to know whether Nia kept that ticket or lost everything, stay with this story all the way to the end. Nia Holloway finished her overnight cleaning shift at the Delverton office building at 11:47 on a Thursday, stepped out into a November rain that had been coming down since dusk, and found her car dead at the intersection of Crestwood and 9th. The alternator finally giving out the way she had known it would since October, just never at this hour and never in this weather. She was 39 years old, a mother and a woman who had spent the last 3 months running the same calculation over and over: rent, utilities, the prescription copay that had gone up in September, the groceries she had cut down to fit in a single reusable bag, the wire transfer to cover the gap in Tessa's community college tuition 2 cities over. 3 months ago, she had been the inventory compliance officer for 42 Ashbourne Express locations across the state, a job she had been good at. A job she had lost after submitting a report that flagged unusual activity in several product batch codes, a report that her supervisor had reviewed, dismissed, and then caused to disappear along with her access badge and her severance. In the pocket of her jacket was a single folded dollar bill, the last thing left after every other obligation had been met. She coasted the sedan into the nearest parking lot, saw the Ashbourne Express sign above the entrance, and went inside to use the customer phone and get out of the cold. The store was quiet in the way that late-night stores always are, fluorescent lights humming just off-key, floor carrying the smell of pine cleaner and stale coffee. A security camera over the entrance pointed at an angle that made the recording quality seem optional. The tow service quoted her 45 minutes. Nia stood near the counter and looked at the scratch ticket display to her left, where a laminated poster announced a top prize of $15 million for $1 per entry. She was not a gambler and had never considered herself one. She had watched people in difficult years convince themselves that scratch tickets were a form of planning, and had found it quietly heartbreaking each time. But 45 minutes is a long time to stand in a wet coat with nothing left to manage, and the dollar in her pocket was too small to do anything practical, and too significant to feel trivial. She took it out, set it on the counter, and asked the cashier, a young woman named Lena Ford, for the last ticket on the rack. Standing near the back of the store, wearing a plain dark coat accompanied by no one, was Conrad Ashbourne. He was 51 years old, the founder of Ashbourne Holdings, whose combined portfolio of retail stores, hotels, and commercial real estate was valued in the billions. And he was conducting one of his occasional unannounced visits to check operations without the preparation that always preceded official reviews. Earlier that evening, before Nia arrived, he had told Lena, almost as an aside, without stopping, that he wanted to hold the last ticket in the current rack roll, the one Lena was now scanning for Nia. He had said it the way a man says things when he expects them to simply happen. He had not tendered payment. He had not taken a receipt. He had stepped away to answer a call from his head of retail, and the transaction had been left incomplete in the way that things stay incomplete when a person is accustomed to the world pausing until they return. Lena took the dollar, processed the transaction, printed the receipt, and passed the ticket across the counter. Nia folded the receipt into her inside jacket pocket, held the small waxy square in her left hand, and was turning toward the seating area near the window when she heard the voice behind her, low and unhurried and shaped by years of being obeyed without follow-up. "That ticket is mine." She stopped. She felt the receipt in her pocket and the ticket in her hand, and turned to find Conrad Ashbourne watching her with the patient expression of a man who expects the inconvenience to resolve itself before he has to explain why it should. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She looked at him the way a person looks at an equation that already has a known solution and said evenly, "You may have wanted it, but I'm the one who paid for it." At the back of the store, the office door opened, and the manager, Bryce Calloway, stepped out into the fluorescent light and recognized who was standing near his counter. Bryce Calloway was 37 years old and had spent his career learning to read a room, and the room he read in the 2 seconds it took him to recognize Conrad Ashbourne required no deliberation at all. He walked to the counter, positioned himself between Nia and the exit, and told her she had made a mistake and should return the ticket to Mr. Ashbourne. Said it without asking Lena what had happened, without requesting the facts from either party, and without any reference to the receipt Nia was already holding in her hand. The receipt showed a timestamp of 11:52, a $1 transaction, and the code for the ticket in question. Bryce looked at it and said it was irrelevant because Conrad had expressed his intention to purchase the ticket, which in Bryce's interpretation made the ticket already spoken for. Nia asked Bryce to define expressed intention. Bryce said Conrad had selected the ticket before the purchase was finalized. Nia said that a scratch ticket belongs to the person who pays for it. Bryce's eyes moved to her wet coat, her second-hand boots, and the cleaning company badge still clipped to her jacket, and he said, clearly enough for everyone in the store to hear, that a woman who had to count every dollar probably should not be spending her last one on scratch tickets. Nia did not respond to that. She looked at Lena instead and asked in front of Bryce and in front of Conrad whether Mr. Ashbourne had tendered any payment before Nia approached the counter. Lena looked at Bryce. Bryce looked at Lena. Then Lena said, quietly and carefully, that Mr. Ashbourne had not yet completed a transaction. Bryce pivoted. He said he now recognized Nia as a former Ashbourne retail employee who had been terminated for filing a falsified internal report, and he said it seemed awfully convenient that she had appeared at one of the company's stores on the same evening the founder happened to be conducting a visit, and he used the word convenient 3 times in 2 sentences, each time as an accusation wearing the grammar of an observation. Conrad, who had remained quiet through most of this, offered Nia $100 for the ticket, not as an admission that it was hers, but as a practical solution to a situation he had already decided should not require this much of his evening. Nia said no without a pause. Conrad raised the offer to $1,000 and said the ticket hadn't been scratched yet and might be worth nothing at all, and the practical thing was to take the money and call it done. Nia said that this had stopped being a conversation about money. She was the legal owner of the ticket, and she was not going to surrender it because the alternative was more convenient for the people in the room who had not paid for it. Bryce, reading Conrad's continued presence as authorization, pressed the security panel near the register and told the night guard to lock the front doors. Before any of that mattered, while the attention in the room was still moving between Conrad and Bryce and the door, Nia reached into her jacket and produced a ballpoint pen. She turned the ticket over and signed her full name in clear block letters across the back. No one stopped her. No one moved fast enough. The signature took perhaps 3 seconds and was witnessed by the counter camera, by Lena, and by 2 people who would spend the next several weeks wishing it had not happened. Bryce watched her do it and then said, with the confidence of a man trying to reduce the stakes before they could be counted, the ticket was probably not even a winner. Nia set the pen down, picked up the coin she had left beside the register, looked at Bryce, and began to scratch. She worked from left to right across the 3 panels, slow and deliberate, the way someone moves when they know the room is watching and have decided to give it something to watch. The first symbol was a red star, the second was a red star. Bryce said something under his breath. Conrad said nothing. Lena put both hands flat on the counter. The third panel took 4 seconds, and when the silver came away it showed the same red star, and the verification machine of the counter connected to the state lottery system produced a 2-tone confirmation sound that everyone in the store recognized and no one had expected. $15 million. The display confirmed it in green, and the machine printed a verification slip before Nia had moved an inch. The silence lasted 3 seconds before Bryce changed entirely. He was no longer discussing a ticket of uncertain value. He was talking about corporate property diverted from its rightful destination by a former employee with a documented grievance against the company. He used the phrase chain of custody as though he had been keeping it in reserve. Nia had not moved from where she was standing. She held the ticket in both hands and watched Bryce perform the real-time renegotiation of his own previous statements with the stillness of someone who has witnessed this particular kind of flexibility before. Conrad was also recalibrating, though in a different register. The amount was not, by any honest accounting, significant relative to his net worth. What the money could not explain was something older and more private. His father had owned a hardware store in a small Ohio city and had bought scratch tickets every week for 30 years, always the last one in the roll, because he believed, without embarrassment, that the last ticket in any series carried the luck of everything that had come before it. Conrad had continued the habit after his father died, quietly and without explanation, and the last ticket in this particular roll was now in the hands of a woman who had paid for it while he was across the store answering his phone. Bryce told the guard to take the ticket. The guard stepped forward. Nia did not step back, did not release the ticket, and said in a voice that carried to the front of the store that she was going to call the police and report that she was being detained against her will by employees of Ashbourne Holdings. Bryce said she was not being detained. She was being asked to cooperate with a corporate security procedure. Nia said she had a receipt, a signed ticket, and a verification slip from the state lottery system, and that she would like to exercise her right to leave. The guard did not know what to do. Neither did Bryce. Lena was staring at a fixed point on the wall and had decided that if she did not participate in what was happening, she might not be responsible for it, which was a calculation that would not hold. The police arrived 11 minutes after Nia's call. The officer listened to Bryce for 2 minutes, listened to Nia for 2 minutes, looked at the time-stamped receipt and told Bryce he had no lawful basis to detain Nia or her property, that this was a civil matter and that he was to unlock the doors. The doors were unlocked. It was the first small reversal of the evening. Bryce had called security expecting to corner Nia, and the arrival of law enforcement produced a warning directed entirely at him. But as Nia moved toward the exit, Bryce's eyes fell on the batch code printed on the back of the ticket, and his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with $15 million. He took out his phone, photographed the code, and sent it to Everett Halstead before the tow truck had even reached Nia's car. The message beside the image said, Batch 7C-119. Still active. Less than 1 hour later, Nia's phone rang from the legal office of Ashbourne Holdings. They wanted to meet that night. The hotel lobby that Ashbourne Holdings used its local corporate venue was the kind of place where the marble was real and the potted plants were replaced on a weekly schedule regardless of whether they needed it. And the woman at the reception desk looked at Nia's wet coat and cleaning service shoes with the controlled expression that comes from training in the precise art of polite dismissal. Nia walked past her. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked into a private conference room, and found 2 attorneys she did not know, a glass of water no one offered her, and Conrad Ashbourne sitting at the far end of the table, silent in the way of a man who considers his presence itself a form of argument. The man who spoke was Everett Halstead, 48 years old, the executive director of Ashbourne Retail, wearing a suit that had been pressed since the meeting was arranged and a tie that cost more than Nia's monthly grocery budget. He spoke in the warm, careful tone of someone who has spent years packaging bad news in the language of a favor. Halstead said the company recognized the situation had become more complicated than necessary, and that in the interest of a quick and fair resolution, they were prepared to offer Nia $50,000 in exchange for the ticket, an executed confidentiality agreement, and a written acknowledgement that Conrad Ashbourne had selected the ticket prior to her purchase. He said $50,000 with a slight pause before the number, the way people do when they expect the number to end the conversation on its own. Nia listened to all of it before she responded. Then she said, "You don't want to buy a $15 million ticket for $50,000. You want to buy my statement." Halstead said she was oversimplifying. She said she did not think she was. Halstead shifted approaches. He said he understood she was in a difficult position and said it with the specific gentleness that is really a form of threat. The gentleness that wants the other person to feel grateful for being understood rather than angry about being assessed. He mentioned, with practiced casualness, that he was aware of her overdue rent, her car trouble, the tuition balance at Tessa's college, and the termination that had left her without severance. He recited these facts as though he had coincidentally encountered them, rather than had someone compile them in the preceding 3 hours for use in this room. Nia looked at him and said, "You investigated my daughter's tuition." Halstead said they wanted to understand the full picture. Conrad said nothing. He asked why a corporation worth several $1 billion would offer $50,000 for a $15 million ticket rather than taking the matter to a court that could hear the evidence inside a week. No one answered. She let the question sit in the room and then said it again, differently. "What is it about this ticket that you need to make disappear?" The 2 attorneys looked at their folders. Halstead said the offer was generous and she should consider the alternative carefully. Litigation with the company of Ashbourne's resources could run for many years while any prize payment remained frozen. He said many years with the deliberateness of someone who wants it to register as a sentence. Conrad spoke then quietly and said, "Taking the money is the smart play." Nia looked at him for a moment and said, "Rich people tend to call poor people's surrenders the smart choice." She stood, gathered the ticket, the receipt, and the verification slip and put them inside her jacket. Before she walked out, she looked at the batch code printed on the ticket's back, 119, and recognized the sequence from a spreadsheet she had built herself, from a report she had submitted 3 months ago and never gotten back. The ticket was worth more than $15 million. It was worth exactly as much as the truth she had been fired for telling. 3 months before that rainy Thursday, Nia Holloway had spent her working days cross-referencing inventory records across 42 Ashbourne Express locations, a job that required patient, systematic attention to numerical patterns and that she had always found satisfying in the way of a well-balanced equation. In October, running a routine reconciliation on lottery product inventory, she found something that did not fit. 11 batches of scratch tickets across 3 store clusters had been reported as water damaged and destroyed following a flooding incident at the regional distribution center, written off entirely, inventory zeroed. No liability recorded. 6 weeks later, point-of-sale data from an adjacent district showed revenue from batch codes that matched the destroyed inventory. Tickets reported as non-existent were generating sales. She pulled the data going back 14 months. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. Halstead's department had been filing destruction certifications on lottery batches, which allowed Ashbourne Retail to avoid remitting unsold ticket revenue to the State Lottery Commission. The batches were then physically transferred, by truck with modified shipping manifests, to stores that ran a portion of their lottery sales off-system, meaning cash transactions that did not enter the central inventory database. The money was divided among a network of store managers, regional coordinators, and at least one shell company registered in the name of a relative of Halstead's. Batch 7C, 119 had been among the certified destroyed batches. It should not have existed anywhere. Somewhere between the destruction filing and that Thursday night, someone had moved it to an active rack at the Ashbourne Express on Crestwood and 9th. Naya compiled everything into a 12-page internal compliance report, attached the relevant data files, and submitted it through the proper channel to her department head, with a copy forwarded to the regional compliance director. Within 72 hours, her system access was suspended. Within a week, she was informed that an internal review had found her report to contain unsubstantiated conclusions and that her conduct in generating it had violated data handling protocols. Halstead had signed the termination authorization. The data files attached to her report were deleted from the company's server. The only copy that still existed was in a personal email she had sent to herself the morning before submitting the report, because years of compliance work had given her the habit of never being the only person holding her own receipts. She found Ivy Bennett through a legal aid referral. Ivy was 43 years old, a civil attorney who had spent 8 years in a prosecutor's office before private practice, and her first impression of the case was that it was a straightforward property dispute over a lottery ticket. Her second impression formed 40 minutes into the first meeting when Naya spread batch documentation across the table alongside the printed compliance report, was that it was not. Ivy filed an emergency motion that same night asking the court to prevent any claim on the prize until ownership was determined, and she submitted a simultaneous data preservation request to the State Lottery Commission requiring them to lock all records associated with Batch 7C, 119. State Lottery investigator Nolan Pierce was assigned the inquiry on Friday morning. Methodical, 45 years old, professionally indifferent to the status of either party. His preliminary review confirmed that the destruction certification for Batch 7, 119 had been submitted by Ashbourne Retail and signed by a compliance officer handpicked by Halstead the previous spring. The batch had been officially non-existent for 8 months. The verification machine on Crestwood had read it as fully valid. That discrepancy had only one explanation, and the explanation was not an accident. Ivy told Naya what the evidence was beginning to add up to. "They thought you were holding a winning scratch ticket," she said. "What you're actually holding is the document that proves you were right about everything." The story that appeared in the following morning had been given to a reporter by someone inside Halstead's communications chain, and it had the specific shape of a narrative constructed to arrive first and crowd out whatever came after it. It described a former Ashbourne Retail employee, not named, but identifiable to anyone with access to the company's HR records or the parking lot camera footage that ran alongside the article, who had allegedly taken a lottery ticket intended for another customer, then refused to return it, and was now threatening litigation as a form of personal retaliation against her former employer. The piece used the word alleged 12 times, the word dispute 8 times, and it included a photograph of Nia's car in the store parking lot taken from an angle that made her look furtive rather than simply wet. By midday, the photograph had circulated widely, and the narrative had calcified in public understanding into something that was almost entirely wrong but very easy to absorb. The cleaning company called Nia that afternoon and said they were temporarily pausing her assignments while the matter was ongoing, which was corporate language for not wanting to appear in a caption. Her landlord sent written notice that any unpaid balance had to be settled within 10 business days or eviction proceedings would begin. Tessa called from school and Nia told her it would be fine, believed it while she was saying it, and was less certain the moment she hung up. Conrad Ashbourne saw the coverage and said nothing publicly, which functioned as an endorsement. He had reservations about the press leak. It felt aggressive, and he was not sure it would hold if the facts became more complicated. But he did not act on those reservations, which meant they were not yet strong enough to displace his operating assumption that Nia D had found an opportunity and was pressing it. Ivy told Nia that the correct response to a narrative designed to make her look opportunistic was not anger, because anger would be used as confirmation, and was not silence because silence would be read as concession. The correct response was evidence, in the smallest number of statements possible. They released 3 items: the time-stamped receipt, a notarized copy of the signed ticket, and a statement from the State Lottery Commission confirming that no completed transaction from Conrad Ashbourne existed in the store's records for that evening. Ivy drafted 3 sentences to accompany those items. Nia approved them, and the statement went out that afternoon. By evening, the coverage had begun to fracture. Reporters who had filed the first version were making calls the first version had not required. 2 days after the initial story ran, Nia's phone rang from an unfamiliar number. The caller was Lena Ford. Lena said she had been shown a document by Bryce Calloway and told to sign it, a written statement asserting that the ticket had been held at the register for Conrad Ashbourne prior to Nia's arrival and that the sale to Nia had been a processing error. Lena said she had not signed it. She said she had told Bryce she needed time to think, and Bryce had told her that her continued employment depended on the decision she made. Lena also said she had heard Bryce, in the minutes after the police store Thursday night, make a call from the back office that began with the words, "The 7C batch is still out there." Nia asked whether Lena would be willing to repeat what she had just said in a formal proceeding. There was a pause. Ivy had Lena formally designated as a protected witness under the state's whistleblower statute within 24 hours. Nia then filed 3 separate complaints, one for unlawful detention on the night of the incident, one for retaliation against a protected reporter, herself, from 3 months prior, and one for witness tampering arising from Bryce's approach to Lena. The 3 complaints together changed the case from a customer versus corporation dispute over a purchase into a documented pattern of institutional misconduct. Halstead could no longer contain it within the lottery ticket frame. The court scheduled a public evidentiary hearing. Subpoenas went out to Conrad Ashbourne, Bryce Calloway, Lena Ford, and Nia Holloway. That same evening, Halstead sent a message to the store's data security team asking about the retention schedule for external camera backups. The hearing room was not a courtroom but functioned like one in every way that mattered. Presiding officer at the front, testimony under oath, and a gallery full of reporters who had come expecting a corporate power story and were getting one, though not the version any of them had initially filed. Nia sat at one table with Ivy. The Ashbourne Holdings legal team, 4 attorneys in suits of coordinated cost, occupied the other. Conrad sat slightly apart from his own lawyers in the manner of a man who wants it understood he is present as a participant rather than a defendant, a distinction that would erode steadily as the morning progressed. Bryce Calloway sat where he had been told to sit and held very still, which Nia recognized as the posture of someone who has already done the arithmetic and does not like the results. Bryce testified first. He stated that Conrad Ashbourne had communicated his intention to purchase the last ticket in the rack prior to Nia's arrival, that he, Bryce, had instructed Lena to hold it for Mr. Ashbourne, and that this constituted a reservation Nia had overridden by presenting her dollar. Ivy introduced the machine register log for that evening, which showed 0 pending reservations at the time of Nia's transaction and showed the $1 sale to Nia as the sole completed transaction for that ticket. Bryce adjusted his account and said Conrad had verbally communicated his intention directly to him and that the reservation was informal. Ivy asked whether any informal reservation had ever at any point been entered into the register system. Bryce said it had not. Ivy asked whether the register system required a completed financial transaction before a ticket could be considered sold. After a pause, Bryce said yes. Nolan Pierce then presented his findings on the register data. The machine log showed that after the prize was confirmed, the register had been accessed remotely by a user ID registered to Bryce Calloway, and that an attempt had been made to insert a retroactive transaction showing a cash payment from Conrad Ashbourne predating Nia's purchase. The attempt had failed because the Lottery Commission's data integrity protocols did not permit retroactive insertion without commission authorization. The failed entry existed in the log with Bryce's credentials attached to it. Lena Ford testified that Conrad had told her he wanted the last ticket but had not paid for it, that she had treated this as a preference rather than a completed purchase, and that when Nia arrived and paid, she had processed it as a valid transaction because that was what it was. She said she had taken Nia's dollar, run the sale, printed the receipt, and handed the ticket to Nia, and that Conrad had not yet returned to the counter when any of that happened. When the Ashbourne legal team suggested in cross-examination that she was a junior employee trying to deflect responsibility for a consequential error, Lena said, "I didn't make an error. I processed a transaction from the customer who paid." Ivy let that stand without addition. Conrad's testimony was brief because Ivy asked him only 3 questions. She asked whether he had presented any payment to Lena Ford before Nia's purchase. He answered no. She asked whether he had received a receipt for any transaction involving that ticket. He answered no. She asked whether, at the moment Nia placed her dollar on the counter, he had been holding the ticket in his hand or had it in his possession in any form. He answered no. The three answers required no elaboration. The legal standard for ownership of a lottery ticket, payment, receipt, and physical delivery had been satisfied entirely by one person in that store, and that person was not Conrad Ashbourne. Nolan Pierce then returned to present the final piece of evidence, the external server backup. The Ashbourne Express on Crestwood stored camera footage locally, but the security system, an upgrade installed the previous year, also transmitted encrypted backups to an offsite server every 4 hours. Bryce's attempt to delete the in-store footage had removed it from the local system and had not reached the backup. The footage showed, in sequence, Nia placing $1 on the counter, Lena scanning the ticket and handing it across, Conrad returning to the counter after the exchange was fully complete, Nia signing the back of the ticket in view of the counter camera, Bryce locking the door despite Nia's audible request to leave, and then Bryce photographing the batch code on the ticket back and immediately placing a phone call. The timestamp between the photograph and the call was 14 seconds. The motion to declare Nia Holloway the sole legal owner of the ticket was granted before the hearing concluded. The presiding officer then noted that the footage also showed Bryce's phone screen reflected in the counter glass at the moment he photographed the code. The number he called and the message he sent were legible. The investigation into Ashbourne Retail's lottery product practices was formally expanded before anyone left the room. The expanded investigation produced numbers that had the weight of things that should have been found years earlier. Investigators identified 63 lottery product batches that had been reported as destroyed or damaged by Ashbourne Retail over a 4-year period, but whose codes had subsequently appeared in sales records at stores other than the ones where destruction had been certified. The revenue from those tickets, scratch sales, prize redemptions, secondary transactions, had not been fully remitted to the State Lottery Commission as required. A portion had moved through intermediary accounts into 3 shell companies registered in the names of Halstead's brother-in-law, a former Ashbourne logistics director, and an entity incorporated in a state where beneficial ownership disclosure was not required. The total estimated diverted revenue was north of $8 million, with forensic accountants noting the figure was preliminary and likely to grow. Every finding mapped onto the 12-page report Nia had submitted in October. Every batch code the investigators flagged appeared in her original dataset. Every shell company transaction correlated with the inventory anomalies she had documented. The file deletion from the company server had been logged under Halstead's administrative credentials and executed within hours of Nia's submission. The investigative record made the sequence unmistakable. Nia had discovered a functioning fraud, reported it correctly through the proper channel, been terminated to silence it, and had then ended up, through a coincidence of the kind that happens when a cover-up runs long enough, holding in her hands the one piece of physical evidence that could not be digitally erased. Conrad called an emergency board meeting on a Saturday morning. He sat at the head of a table of people who were mostly angry and partly frightened, and he let Halstead speak first because Halstead had asked to, and because Conrad wanted to watch how Halstead spoke when a significant volume of evidence was already in the room. Halstead spoke with the disciplined confidence of a man who has spent 4 years building a story and still believed the construction was sound. He described the investigation as the product of a disgruntled former employee who had used a coincidence to manufacture leverage, said the compliance report had been reviewed and found inconclusive at the time, and suggested that escalating this into a corporate scandal would damage the company, its shareholders, and, with a specific look at Conrad, its founder's reputation. Nia had been invited to attend as a whistleblower witness, and she sat across from Halstead in an Ashbourne boardroom for the first time, wearing the same jacket she had worn on the night the ticket was scratched and not apologizing for it. Several board members did not quite look at her when she came in the way of people uncertain what to do with someone who has made them uncomfortable by being right. Halstead looked at her and said that what had begun with an irresponsible decision, spending her last dollar on a scratch ticket, had escalated into a misdirected inquiry consuming company resources that belonged elsewhere. Nia opened a folder. Inside was a printed copy of her October compliance report with the submission timestamp on the first page, the self-forwarded email with the data attachments, the server log showing Halstead's credentials on the deletion command, and a letter from the Lottery Commission confirming that her batch analysis was consistent with their own preliminary findings. She said, addressing the room rather than Halstead, "He wasn't afraid of me spending $1. He was afraid of the ticket proving that I understood his operation better than he thought I did." She set the folder in the center of the table. Conrad looked at the folder. He looked at Halstead. He looked at the folder again and then at Nia, and in the process of doing those 3 things he arrived, without assistance, without a lawyer prompting him, at a conclusion that changed everything that followed. Halstead had not pushed him to contest the ticket to protect the company's interests. He had leveraged Conrad's ego and his private sentimentality about his father's lottery habit as a mechanism for silencing the one person who had documented the fraud in a legally traceable form. If Conrad had succeeded in getting Nia to sign the confidentiality agreement and surrender the ticket, Halstead could have ensured the batch was never examined by the commission. Conrad had been used as a shield without being told he was holding one. He turned to the head of corporate security and said to lock Halstead's system access before anyone left the building. Halstead said it was an overreaction. He said the evidence would exonerate him. He said the real story was about a disgruntled employee with a grudge. He was still saying this when two investigators who had been waiting in the hallway came through the door, and whatever came next dissolved before it reached language. Before the entire board, Conrad Ashbourne said, "I was wrong to claim that ticket was mine." Nia looked at him and said, "You don't only need to say that to me." The press conference was held on the following Tuesday, in a venue chosen by the Lottery Commission and the court, rather than by Ashbourne Holdings, and this detail mattered in a way that was immediately visible in the arrangement of the chairs and microphones, and in the fact that Conrad Ashbourne was seated at a table rather than standing at a podium of his choosing. The Commission's official findings had been made public that morning. The statement confirmed that Nia Holloway was the sole lawful purchaser and owner of the winning ticket in the amount of $15 million, on the basis that she had tendered the only payment recorded by the register, received the only receipt issued for the transaction, taken physical possession of the ticket directly from the cashier, and placed an authenticated signature on the ticket prior to any formal dispute arising. Conrad Ashbourne's claim of prior ownership had been found to have no evidentiary support in any form. Bryce Calloway had been terminated that morning and notified, through his attorney, that he faced civil and potentially criminal exposure for three things: tampering with store records after the prize was confirmed, documented pressure on a witness who had subsequently reported the contact, and participation in the physical transfer of lottery batches reported as destroyed. The criminal referral was with the district attorney. Bryce's attorney had already called the prosecutor's office twice, which meant the calculation about whether protecting Halstead was worth the cost was not resolving in Halstead's favor. Everett Halstead had been placed on administrative suspension, his credentials revoked, and the shell company accounts connected to his network frozen by court order. His attorney had issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, which was the kind of statement issued when the underlying position is untenable and the remaining strategy is delay. The reception desk attendant at Ashbourne Holdings Corporate, who had surveyed Nia's wet coat with practiced indifference on the night of the hotel meeting, now had to step aside and hold the door open as Nia came in for a different kind of meeting. The attorneys who had described years of sustained litigation as an outcome Nia should weigh carefully had been removed from the case by their firm following a conflict of interest review. Several people who had been comfortable standing beside the version of event cast Nia as an opportunist were quietly no longer standing near any version of any story. Those who had once looked through her, past her, or down at her were now in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that she had been in the room all along. Conrad read a prepared statement. He said he had not paid for the ticket, had not received a receipt, and had not held it at any point before Nia purchased it. He said the company had exercised institutional pressure against a private citizen who had done nothing wrong in either context, not in the store, and not in her October compliance report. He said her report should have been acted on rather than suppressed, and that the failure to act had allowed a fraud to continue and cause measurable harm. He said he was sorry. He said it to the cameras and then to Nia, and Nia received the apology without warmth or coldness, which was the appropriate temperature for an apology made necessary by evidence rather than conscience. A reporter asked Conrad why he had initially insisted the ticket was his. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have lived too long in a world where people move when I speak." Nia leaned forward slightly and said, "This time, the person standing in front of you didn't move." She then stated 4 requirements of Ashbourne Holdings for the public record: full reimbursement of all legal costs, compensatory damages for the termination and the reputational harm from the press campaign, the establishment of an independent whistleblower protection office within the company reporting directly to the board rather than to any executive, and the public release of the full investigative findings rather than a private settlement. Conrad accepted all 4. Lena Ford was promoted to assistant store manager at the Ashbourne Express on Crestwood, which reopened 2 months later under new district management. Nia received the lottery funds 4 months after the hearing. Once the prize verification was finalized, the legal accounts were settled, and the tax arrangements were handled by a financial advisor she had chosen herself without any referral from Ashbourne Holdings. She did not buy a house immediately. She paid the overdue rent through the end of the lease, cleared the remaining balance on Tessa's tuition, and bought a reliable used car based on the repair cost estimates she had gotten from 3 separate mechanics rather than on anything else. She put a portion of the money into accounts designated not to be touched for 10 years, because she had spent enough of her life watching other people's luck run out the moment they stopped paying attention to it, and she had no intention of becoming that example. 3 months after receiving the funds, she registered a company called Holloway Integrity Partners, focused on internal audit services and whistleblower representation for mid-size retail operations. The concept had come to her not as inspiration, but as the logical continuation of the work she had been doing at Ashbourne before Halstead ended it. The same skills, the same methodology, applied without a management layer that could delete the results. She hired 2 people she had worked with before, one of them a former logistics coordinator who had been quietly laid off from a regional grocery chain 6 months earlier after raising questions about inventory discrepancies that sounded, to Nia, very familiar. Ivy Bennett agreed to serve as outside counsel. Nolan Pierce, having retired from the Lottery Commission, agreed to consult on investigative methodology. Conrad approached Nia about returning to Ashbourne Holdings. He did not frame it as employment exactly. He used the phrase leadership role and mentioned the restructuring underway and the need for someone with genuine operational knowledge of the retail compliance function. Nia listened and said she would not be working for him. Conrad asked whether she would consider a different arrangement. Nia said she would consider an independent auditing contract, would conduct the company's complaint reviews and report directly to the board, not to Conrad, not to whoever replaced Halstead, not to anyone whose compensation was tied to the findings. Conrad considered this for a day and agreed. The arrangement was not friendship, not gratitude, and not reconciliation. It was a business relationship between 2 people who had a precise and documented understanding of what each of them was capable of. The Ashbourne Express on Crestwood was the first location audited under the new agreement. The audit found 3 procedural gaps in the lottery product tracking system that had not been part of the original fraud, but that created conditions for something similar to develop undetected. The gaps were reported to the board, published in summary in the company's quarterly disclosure, and corrected within 60 days. It was exactly the outcome Nia's October report had been designed to produce, the outcome that had been buried, the outcome that had cost her a job and 3 months of the kind of financial arithmetic that leaves marks on a person. It had taken longer to arrive than it should have, and by a route that no one would have designed, but it had arrived. Tessa came back for a long weekend in the spring. She sat in her mother's new office, a rented space on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of clean air and new paint, and looked at the framed document on the wall. The October compliance report, the copy Nia had emailed to herself the morning before submitting it, mounted beside the certificate of incorporation for Holloway Integrity Partners. She asked whether they had won because of the ticket. Nia reached behind her desk and brought out a small wooden frame containing a single folded dollar bill, the one Conrad Ashbourne had returned to her after the press conference with a handwritten note that said only, "The night it started." She set it on the desk between them. The ticket had been luck. Every step taken after the ticket had been something else entirely. One billionaire once believed the world would rearrange itself the moment he said, "That ticket is mine." But a woman with $1 left had refused to step aside, and in doing so, made every dollar that followed mean exactly what it should.